Hey, what's going on? I'm Alex Southey, and you are listening to Your Worst Song. I'm just recording this intro as I walk down Wallace Avenue towards Wallace Espresso. This is a bonus interview. I revived it from the doldrums, the receptacle that was the Human Interest Hour podcast, because it's interesting. And I spoke to a historian, and I kept wanting to speak to a historian, and now I've done it. It's history. In this case, it's Adam Bunch, a Toronto historian. We talk about how he got his start. Obviously, he was interested in history from a kid, but he really got his start in earnest when he was on his lunch breaks from his regular office job downtown, and he would go around and look at essentially the local history and glean it, pick it up. And then that became his real work. He's authored a few different books about Toronto. He's done lots of different classes and walks. He does tours in Toronto. So if you're into history or into Toronto, you'll enjoy this, all right? I'm Alex Southey, and this is Your Worst Song. No, I fancy woman's voice. I basically started this podcast, and I decided I wanted to talk to people from every kind of discipline, I suppose, but history is where some of my background lies, especially in it's what I studied in school and stuff like that. I didn't end up going into it or anything, but at least it's, some better common ground than before I speak to somebody who like breaks in horses or something, which is on the list. But yeah, so I'd love to talk to you, Adam, about first of all, how you even got interested in history.
Well, I grew up with it a little bit. My parents were both born and raised in Toronto. Most of my grandparents were too. So I grew up with just stories of them growing up in the city that was just ordinary family lore. And I always was really interested in history. And when it came time to go to university, I applied for history, but also film. And I actually don't have that academic background in it because I went into the film stream instead and got a screenwriting and English degree.
Oh, that's funny. That was my exact path, by the way. That I didn't get a film degree, but I went into screenwriting specific, and then I didn't end up following that. I'm more in music, but that's really funny.
Yeah. And after school, I ended up in music too. I played in bands, but really got into writing about music. So for a while, I was the editor-in-chief of an online music magazine, kind of in the early 2000s.
Cool.
Prize jury and stuff. And that was kind of my every waking moment for a few years.
Yeah.
It turns out, you might have noticed, the early 2000s weren't like a great time to try to make your living off record reviews and interviewing bands.
No.
So in time, that kind of fell apart and gave way to trying to figure out the next thing. And I've been writing a lot about Toronto bands and learning a bit about the musical history, and ended up working just a terrible office job that was in the St. Lawrence Market neighborhood in St. James, which is the oldest neighborhood in the city. The city was founded on Indigenous land. That's the first 10 blocks the British laid out. So it's filled with history. And I'd go out on my lunch hour and kind of wander around the neighborhood, have, pea meal bacon sandwich from the St. Lawrence Market and read some plaques and see the old buildings. I started getting more interested in that and Googling the stories behind them when I got back to my desk, and then fell into writing about it in kind of a strange, unlikely way, which is that I was also writing a lot of fiction, tiny little short stories at the time that were kind of surrealist little things that I wasn't sure what to do with because they weren't very long. There wasn't too much to them, but I was enjoying doing it. This was 2010, which was the same summer that Banksy came to Toronto and put up work around the city. And one of them was in the St. Lawrence Market neighborhood. It's the only one that's still there in the place he put it, on the back of what's now the Goose Island Brewery. And
really? I don't know if I can think of that, but I've been in the area a bunch of times, so obviously I've seen it, and I just haven't thought about it. What is the design?
It's kind of hidden away. It's just off the Esplanade, like Esplanade and Church. That's where the Goose Island Brewery is. And then on the back wall, sort of on Church Street, there's a tiny little patio. And just off the sidewalk, there's some plexiglass protecting some artwork of some guys looking at graffiti, standing as if they're in an art gallery. Which is that piece. And it's the only one that got sort of instantly protected. So there's another one that got like the wall came down, and you'll find it in the path.
Gotcha.
Off York Street. But this is the only one that's still in the place that it went up. And I went to go see it as soon as it went up. I was a fan of street art and really interested in the idea of putting art in public places. I always kind of liked the idea of doing that, and what Keith Haring did in the subways in New York City, just doing his chalk on chalkboards and stuff. I always really liked the idea of putting my stories into the world somehow. So it was kind of a little pilgrimage to go see that piece at lunch. But it also struck me that it didn't have anything to do with the place that he put it. Like, he'd been in Melbourne the week before, and it looked exactly like the stuff he was doing in Melbourne. It didn't reflect the fact that it was on this old building in the oldest neighborhood in Toronto. It didn't really engage with its surroundings at all.
Yeah.
On my walk back to the office, I kind of had that idea rattling around in my head, and the idea of doing things in public places, and these weird little short stories I was writing, and they all kind of coalesced into the idea for my first history project, which was kind of fiction-based and art-based, which is the Toronto Dreams Project, where I took those short stories and started writing them as if they were dreams had by figures in the city's past. And then I started designing little cards for them, took historical images and made collages for one side of the card, put the dream on the other side, started leaving them in public places related to that person's real history. Each one would have a URL on it. So if you found the dream, or collecting them, or just stumbled upon one, you could look up that dream on my website and find links to the real story that kind of inspired the dream story.
Okay.
And started a blog for that, started writing more and more of that real history. And
super quick. That's so cool. I love that idea. That's very fittingly. It's a very old-fashioned idea of leaving something physical there, but then merging it with modern, because there's the QR code. But I'm for my day job for a while, I was in email marketing, so my mind thinks about this. Did you have access on your website to analytics that would show which QR codes were getting the most hits, for example?
What did I have? I guess I had Google Analytics that would tell me which pages were the most popular.
Right. So theoretically, it was either from them searching on Google or the leaving the cards out.
Yeah. And it was probably more about how many cards of a particular person I would be leaving out.
Right.
Actually, early enough that QR codes were really new and people still thought they would never go anywhere.
Yeah.
Early days, I didn't even have QR codes because people would make fun of me for using them because no one ever clicked them. I sort of followed that up with another project I called the Toronto Dreams Project's Sticky Plaque Division. So I just put stickers and put QR codes and URLs on them and just slap them up on telephone poles and stuff. I started doing them for songs too. So I had a sticky bathroom jukebox division too. But I put the same kind of stickers in bathrooms at music venues around the city.
Yeah.
URLs to old Toronto songs, like from musical history.
Oh, very cool.
The bands, and asked them if it was okay to do, and then head into the bathroom at Sneaky D's and lap up a funk song from the 70s that is underappreciated. And for that, when I was putting up sticky plaques with the QR code for places that didn't have their own official plaque that had an interesting story there, and these songs, mercilessly mocked in 2011, 2012.
Well, I'm sorry that happened, because I think that's cool. I've played a lot of those similar sized venues, and I love going into the bathroom, frankly, and seeing all the stickers and all the stuff that's there, and it's a history in its own way. I kind of want to go back, though, in your story to... I'm going to say something that I hope, this is just with regards to history, that I hope isn't harsh to certain parts of history and favoring other parts. But I just feel like you must know there's parts of history that almost everybody's kind of into or knows a bit about. And it's almost like a shoo-in. Like if you make something to do with World War II, it's going to get a lot more eyeballs than some niche thing about a ship, probably, right? So my only question is, and I have an answer for it myself. How did you come around to eventually? I know you explained the experience, but how did you eventually come around in your mind to finding Canadian history that interesting? Because I feel like as a 12-year-old, you start out and you're like, Hitler, that is epic. That is the be all end all. And then this is what happened to me. Over time, it's almost like you settle in more to your own country and you start paying attention more to the surroundings and you wonder the story behind them, and it's as simple as that. So is that it really is as simple as the lunch story that you told me?
I think I followed a similar arc that when I was younger, when I was a teenager, when I was starting to get really interested in history, it was definitely more world history that fascinated me. And Canadian history, I took it, but it wasn't like my big passion. And it's not when I applied to go to university, I didn't think it was going to be Canadian history if I
Exactly.
It was, I think a process of growing a little bit older, of having deeper roots in one place.
Yep.
I had an experience I think about a lot when I was on a bus to Ottawa as part of a protest thing in university. And this long drive to Ottawa where I can't remember, like the G20 or something was meeting in Ottawa. So there were big protests there. And kind of decided spontaneously to do it. So wasn't sitting with my friends, was sitting with a random woman and got to chatting. She talked about the fact that she had traveled all over the world, spent like a year living in Mexico or something. I was really jealous of the fact that she had done all of that. And she said she was jealous of the fact that I had stayed in one place for so long and had such deep roots here. And it did a lot to change my perspective on the fact that maybe there was value in that maybe I can have a deeper understanding of a place in some ways, having grown up with these stories, and that there's value in every community. In the world, every city has these stories to tell, and that maybe it's not necessarily so bad to tell the stories of the place you know best. So that helped a bit and started to feel the value of that. And then, working in the neighborhood, going and seeing the plaques, and then going back to the office, starting to Google some of the stories behind them. There's the age where the Torontoist had wonderful writers like Jimmy Bradburn and Kevin Plummer and David Windsor. We were all writing weekly columns about the history of the city called Historicist for them, which was filled with stories that I'd never heard before and that are as good as any history stories ever, I think. Once you start digging into the history of Toronto, the history of Canada, you realize that we're a place that hasn't always done a very good job of telling our stories, but that those stories are there and that they're fascinating and entertaining and illuminating at the same time, that they're stories about incredible things, circus riots and duels and American invasions and rebellions and plagues, that also have a lot to teach us about the place where we're living and how Toronto and how Canada have ended up being the places they are today, for better and worse. And that I think it gives you a power to try to make a better place when you understand these stories and understand how it ended up how it is today. And that those stories, like they are probably any place in the world, are fascinating, unbelievable, entertaining stories at the same time.
Yeah, I think you make a bunch of really good points there, but one specifically is that I agree with you. I don't actually think Canada has made it. It hasn't made its history appealing to learn in the way that some other. Obviously, it comes down to some teachers or some specific professors or whatever. But in general, I just feel like to care about something. And this is good. This goes for even like all the way to sports to history. You need the context. Like, where's the drama? Where's the stakes? What's the conflict? And so the more you know about what was going on in Toronto in whatever period of history and the context, the more interesting those duels, like you mentioned, or the riots become, right? Because you understand what's at stake.
Yeah, absolutely. Once you start seeing the broader picture and the connections, it's sort of a feedback loop. It builds on itself like a snowball growing, that you start understanding more and more. And one little story, once you know the context of the time, you get to a point where you instantly are like, oh yeah, like holy crap, if that happened, then that has huge implications for all of this stuff.
Exactly.
That's really my favorite thing. There's nothing that I get more excited about than falling down some research rabbit hole and finding some weird, unexpected, very personal story.
Totally.
Huge implications, and that really illuminates big, sweeping historical processes and changes and stuff. And the little weird story that lets you understand how some big change came about through telling the story about that individual person and their weird little life.
So you must be thinking of some examples as you express that. What are some
my favorite, my gold standard for that of one person story being weirdly, unexpectedly weird and having huge implications is Robert Baldwin.
Mm-hmm.
Robert Baldwin's is hugely important politician for the middle of the 1800s, who was the big champion along with his ally La Fontaine from Montreal. He was the Toronto champion of the idea of responsible government, which is the system of democracy we have now, which is often pointed to by people as an example of how boring Canadian history is, because it's sort of a boring sounding term, and it's how we got democracy, unlike the United States, as their big dramatic revolution. But the fight for responsible government is unbelievably dramatic. Like the day it happens, the day a governor general signs off on a law he disagrees with for the first time and says the Canadian people get to choose through their elected representatives, I'm not going to veto it, there are riots. Like they burn down the Parliament buildings that day. There are gunfights in the streets of Montreal and standoffs in Ottawa. And that's at the end of decades of rioting and rebellion and all these dramatic stories. And Robert Baldwin, the central champion, has one of the weirdest stories, I think, in all Canadian history. The story of Michael Cross, when he was doing his biography, dug up a few years ago, which is that Baldwin grew up in Toronto as a teenager who was falling in love all the time, like having endless crushes. And his biggest love of his life was his own cousin, Eliza.
Oh, sure. As you do.
He ends up marrying, despite the fact that that level of incest is very much frowned upon. And they have an age difference, too. Their family tries to split them up, sends her off to New York City for a while, but they're still exchanging love letters and arranging to have a time every month when they both know that they're thinking about each other. She comes back, they get married, they have a few kids. But their fourth kid, the labor is complicated. She needs to have a cesarean section, and the incision, it never heals. And she ends up dying from that surgery and leaves Robert Baldwin deeply heartbroken for the rest of his life. And the whole time he's fighting these struggles over responsible government, he's suffering from bouts of severe depression. He eventually wins. Canada becomes fundamentally a democracy. And when he retires and dies, they lay him to rest in the family's tomb on the grounds of Spadina House. There's a new version of the old house. It's right next door to Casa Loma. And a couple of weeks after they lay him to rest, his family finds a note in one of his old pockets of a vest or a jacket that's a list of his final requests. And some of them are very touching, normal requests. He wants to be buried with the love letters that they exchanged and a locket she gave him as a gift. Some of them are super weird. Like he wants his coffin to be chained to Eliza's coffin so that they'll be together for eternity. And even weirder than that, he wants his corpse to be given the same kind of cesarean section that had killed his wife. And he's really clear in this list that he wants this done even if he's already been laid to rest. So like weeks after he gets put in the tomb, some family members have to go back down inside it with a doctor and a scalpel and crack open his coffin and then split open his corpse, close it back shut, and wrap it in chains with Eliza's coffin.
Oh.
And now that tomb has been moved. It's at St. James Cemetery, sort of overlooking the Don Valley and the Rosedale Ravine. But you can go stand above this gravestone knowing down there is this tomb where like the champion of Canadian democracy is chained to the bones of the woman he loved. And that this is the personal story behind responsible government, which is so often pointed to as like Canadian democracy. It's such an evolution, it's boring, it's slow processes. Here you've got Robert Baldwin, the gothest Canadian.
Seriously, that's so goth. I was gonna say that. That is incredibly, it's incredibly goth. Wow, I see that. I see why that sticks out. And you just did it in a great example of what I'm talking about, which is adding the stakes and the context and everything like that. I see. Yeah, I see why that sticks out. Why? So let's get back to your story. How does it become? Even how does it go from you writing freelance articles about history and things like that and doing what you were doing, leaving the cards around and stuff like that, to more of a real capital P profession?
But yeah, it started with writing the stories to link to from the Dreams website. And eventually, was having, my blog was getting more and more views. Spacing magazine asked me to start writing for them. And eventually Dundurn Press, a big publisher, asked me if I wanted to compile some stories into a book, which was my first book, the Toronto Book of the Dead, which kind of tells the whole history of the city from before it was founded to now through stories about death and dying and stuff.
It's on my way. It's on the way to being delivered to me right now. Yeah,
it's a lot of stories that I had written sort of as part of the Dreams Project blog, plus a bunch of new ones I added as well. Death was a little bit of a cheat code because, as I read in the book, every story ends the same way. Using death as your theme, you can tell almost any story that you want, and they have a lot to teach us about the city. I've more recently followed up with the second book, the Toronto Book of Love, which kind of does the same thing through stories of romance and heartbreak and scandalous affairs and stuff. So I was doing more and more of that real writing. And just over the last few years, the Book of the Dead was being used as a textbook for a course at George Brown. Wonderful professor there, John Weir, had to step away from the course at the last moment a few years ago and asked me, since it was using my book, if I would step in. So I've been able to teach at George Brown basically ever since, doing Toronto history there.
That's cool.
And when the pandemic hit, started doing online courses. They're open to the public over Zoom, and that had a great response. So sort of over the last few years or so, I've just sort of been able to build a bunch of different things. I think a lot of people have different ways that they like engaging with these stories. So I try to do as many different things as I can. The books and teaching and tours and talks and the online courses and social media posts. And I've got a weekly history newsletter too about Toronto stories that have all just managed to kind of add up to the point where I get to do it all day, every day, and don't need an office job like the kind that I had that started it all.
Did it feel amazing?
A lot of fun.
Did it feel amazing to leave that office job that started, no matter how nice the people were, or even if you liked the job generally, was it just like, holy crap, I've kind of really done something here now that I can leave?
Well, that one I actually left a little prematurely. That one I got off.
Okay.
I noticed how much time I was spending Googling other stuff about history at work. So I went from that to as the creative director at a little marketing firm where we mostly did not-for-profit kind of campaigns for people like Kids Help Phone and the United Nations Refugee Agency, which has really helped too. It really helped me see things through sort of a marketing lens and how
it's helpful
people, which was really a really valuable experience. And it was sort of as that was winding down, the owner of that company moved to New York and started doing work there right about the same time that I was able to start making enough money off the history stuff that I was able to transition. So it's almost sort of been a gradual realization that that's happened, that I'm not having to do other works. So there was no like one cathartic moment of it. But some moments of pausing and realizing, this is amazing that it's happening. I get to spend my time writing, and writing has been the central passion really of my life, and stories and storytelling. So it's wonderful to get to do, wonderful that people seem to enjoy it. And there really is, I think, an interest in people want to learn more about their city and about their country. And I think for a long time, people assumed there wasn't an audience for that. And I think it's been wrong over and over again by tons of people. There's so many wonderful storytellers across Toronto and across Canada who are building these audiences and really proving that people care about the history of the places they live and that they think those are valuable stories to know more about.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I'm glad that you're one of the guys out there doing it. What's a part of it doesn't even need to be Toronto history. It can be earlier than Toronto. It can be going back into Indigenous history, like you mentioned. I know we're on Anishinaabe land and other lands. But what's the part of history that you think is super interesting but never is brought up?
It is endless. Like, it'd be hard
I know.
where to go back and learn about. But I spent a lot of my time drawn into the sort of founding era of the city, which is a time people don't talk a lot about.
Right.
Even when Toronto, the wording around it has changed in recent years, but for a long time, people said it was the celebration of Toronto's birthday. That birthday isn't even the beginning of the city as a settlement. It's when it was incorporated as a city decades later, when there were already 10,000 settlers living here. I think some of the history before that ends up getting lost. And the founding moment, which is the end of the 1700s, with the Simcoes, John Grape Simcoe, the founder of the city, and his wife, Elizabeth, who are both fascinating, have their own dramatic stories. He was a British officer during the American Revolution, falling in love with a spy, we think, who is spying on him. She is, during the founding of Toronto, spending a suspicious amount of time alone with her husband's secretary. People have wondered ever since whether they were having an affair. She also becomes like a pyromaniac. Her diary is filled with stories of her lighting fires just to watch them burn because she'd seen a forest fire outside Quebec City, loved the way it looked.
Wow.
So kind of recreating that everywhere she went, which is like an unhinged thing for an English gentlewoman, very respectable family, would be an enormous scandal back home on her country estate.
Right, yeah.
But out here, she's enjoying those freedoms. And those stories that are filled with, these fascinating little kind of dramatic, even scandalous details. And the city that they were trying to set up, Toronto was founded to be a home for refugees, loyalist refugees from the American Revolution. The people who had stayed loyal to the British when the revolution broke out were no longer welcome in the new United States. They were seen as traitors now. And the British set up this colony on this Indigenous land to be very specifically a home for these American British loyalist refugees. And so the city, Simcoe wrote about it, that he wanted it to be an incredibly British place, an incredibly Protestant place. He wanted it to be so amazing and so successfully British that the Americans would get jealous and beg to be let back into the British Empire. Toronto would kick so much ass that it would undo the American Revolution. And that sort of goal was baked into the founding of our city. And that even after the Simcoes left, a lot of people kind of carried on that legacy and had that vision for Toronto. And I think even 230 years later, that's still a legacy that has a real impact on our lives. And when we're debating things like whether you should be able to have a beer in a park or sell wine in a corner convenience store, you can trace that sort of heritage back to that founding of wanting it to be this very Protestant, conservative, British, very reserved, very religious city is something we're still grappling with now, that you can see there in those founding moments. And I think there's a ton of kind of that back at the founding days, and we're lucky Elizabeth Simcoe had this diary and was painting. Yeah. We can have like a day-to-day record of what was happening back then. And then so much of what's going on, you can sort of see, it's almost like the Big Bang. And as it expands, sort of some of that granular stuff is still getting played out today. I find that all really fascinating. And it feels, like such a different place, but, it's still the same land and the same history. So, I spent a lot of time thinking about the late 1700s, early 1800s, and all the battles happening over the future of the city that, created the Toronto today.
Which at the time was York, right? It was not known as Toronto, it was known as York.
Because the Toronto, the name was actually used to refer to this place before they showed up.
That's what I thought,
name,
but because it's a indigenous word, but I don't know a specific nation. What?
Yeah, it's a Haudenosaunee word.
Okay.
That referred, people think, to a spot at what's now Lake Simcoe, where they had fishing weirs in the water, big poles, kind of nets between them. So the word Takronto is meant to mean where there are trees standing in the water. But there was a big trail, the Toronto Carrying Place Trail, big portage route between Lake Ontario, between here and the Humber, and there's a branch on the Rouge too, where you walk up to Lake Simcoe, which then gets you to the upper Great Lakes. And it's this incredibly important shortcut. It's been here as long as anyone can remember. This trail that lets you go from the lower Great Lakes. It's a shortcut up to the upper Great Lakes. Then you're not far from the top of the Mississippi. You can travel into the heart of the continent. So it's an incredibly important spot. And in time, that name kind of migrated down the trail, that it referred to the other end of the trail, then to the trail, then to this end of the trail. And so this place was already known as Toronto before the British showed up. But when they did, the British, as they often were at war with the French. And while the Simcoes were here, living in a fancy tent down by the lake, they got word that the Duke of York, the prince, had won a big victory over the French. Simcoe got really excited and decided to rename the place in honor of the Duke of York, fired off all the cannons, and declared this was now the town of York, which was a little bit premature. The Duke of York would be disgraced pretty quickly after, mostly remembered for a children's nursery rhyme that kids in England still learn today. But the Duke of York marching his army up a hill just to march them back down again, because he was just marching around, mostly didn't fight battles. And then he got caught up in one of the most notorious sex scandals in English history as well. His mistress claimed that she was accepting bribes from people who wanted her to whisper in the Duke of York's ear, preferential military contracts and promotion and stuff. So he would not go on to be particularly celebrated. But the fact that we've got York University in North York and East York trace back to Simcoe getting a little prematurely excited about this victory happening in Europe in 1793.
Wow, well, that's pretty interesting. That's interesting history. I have a few sort of avenues I want to go down conversationally about history, and one of them is selfish, but that's fine. Here's one that I was thinking. I just finished watching the movie Queer, that new movie with Daniel Craig. It's a adaptation of William S. Burroughs, one of his novels. I was thinking about the Beatniks, and Burroughs is from that kind of general group, and that was sort of the generation before the hippies, right? It was such a thing, consequential generation. Does Toronto or Canada have an equivalent to that? And I guess I am specifically asking about writers because obviously I know painting, we have the Group of Seven famously, stuff like that. But yeah, writers, this is more of a random question just because I just saw that movie, but yeah.
There's sort of a long history of Canadians, Torontonians trying to establish more of that cultural scene in the 1800s. There are a few setting out. It doesn't really catch a lot of momentum until the 1900s. And I think that same era, the Beatniks and the hippies, was one of the most transformative eras in Toronto history for sure. I think the central story of Toronto, to me, in a lot of ways, is the story of how it's gone from that incredibly British place Simcoe set up, and it was incredibly British for a very long time after that, to the multicultural city we live in today, a place that celebrates, is very proud of its diversity, where it's literally our city's motto, diversity is our strength. And it's been a very quick process over just the last few decades that up to the Second World War, it's still incredibly British. We still have literally race-based immigration laws that keep Canada very purposefully white. And it's not until after the Second World War when we start getting a lot of immigration from other parts of Europe instead of just the British Isles, which is the overwhelming majority of people who are moving here for a really long time, that as the demographics start to change, the city leadership starts to change too. There's a big landmark election in 1955 that pits an incredibly British candidate who's a leader of the Orange Order, which is this Protestant anti-Catholic society that like rules over Toronto for 120 years, a stranglehold on power, who's running very openly as a Protestant candidate against Nathan Phillips, who the square is named after, who's Jewish, running on a platform where he's promising to be mayor for all the people. And for the first time, there are enough non-British citizens here that Nathan wins. It's this huge landmark. And that's 1955, which is just, I guess, toward the beginning maybe of the Beatnik era. And Toronto has its own Beatnik scene, Gerrard Village, all sort of around Gerrard and Yonge. But in time, some of those buildings there and coffee houses there are getting demolished. They're losing some of their venues. Places like the Bohemian Embassy, which is still in St.
What a name.
Have a laneway. Yeah, it's great. Coffee shop. It's where like Margaret Atwood got her start and Bob Dylan hung out there. And in time, they kind of migrate north to Yorkville. And Yorkville used to be a separate village. By the end of the 1800s, it's getting swallowed up by Toronto, and it's filled with houses that back then are new. But by the 1950s, 1960s, they're old, run-down Victorian houses that have low rents because they're kind of falling apart. So Yorkville starts attracting some of these European immigrants that are from other countries, places like Italy, Poland, places that have suffered during the war, where people are leaving to move here and find new life, are finding new housing there with low rents. And they're importing their Southern and Eastern Europe culture into Toronto. So that's when Toronto starts getting its first coffee houses, its first patios. It's hard to believe. Like, think of a time in Toronto when you didn't have patios in the summer, but
yeah, that kind of just made me do a mental double take. So patios are, I guess I do associate patios, if I really think about it, more with Europe than I do with, you can just picture a friggin' baguette and a coffee and whatever sitting outside of a store. So, wow, but that's crazy that it was something that had to be brought instead of, you think of it as something that is as general as, wouldn't every culture just kind of think of it?
Yeah.
But I guess not.
Eating outside was like not a thing that occurred to this like very waspy city.
Yeah.
Until people from Italy started showing up and opening it. The patio at Cafe Diplomatico is one of the oldest in the city because, of course, one of the oldest patios in the city is going to be in Little Italy.
Yeah.
A bunch of them in Yorkville too, and these coffee houses that gave people somewhere to hang out, drink coffee. Like, we didn't have cafes like before that either. And it really attracted young people, including these beatniks who could hang out at the coffee house, hang out on a patio, drink a coffee, smoke a cigarette, talk about,
pontificate about art and
politics and art and music and ideas. And as I guess their younger siblings came up in the early 60s, sort of shifting into a hippie scene.
Yeah.
And Yorkville became sort of this mecca for anybody who felt like they didn't belong in their own communities or in their own parts of Toronto, but from all across the country and the continent, started flocking. And it was one of the biggest sort of 60s countercultural scenes in the world. Like,
wow, I didn't know that.
They're behind Greenwich Village and Haight-Ashbury.
That's what you always hear about. Yeah.
Yeah, and we're up there too for the 1960s. And unbelievable musicians and writers and artists come out of that scene. So Margaret Atwood was there in the early days. You get William Gibson, the guy who wrote Neuromancer and coined the term cyberspace. He moved here from the States, part to avoid the draft, but also because he heard Toronto had the best hash and he was looking for a drug scene.
Yeah.
And there are like 30 or 40 music venues, all within those few blocks.
Wow.
Where Neil Young and Joni Mitchell are.
Yeah, right.
A lot of bands end up leaving the scene, moving to the United States, because there's not a lot of support for Canadian culture at the time. The big American labels were here, but they were much more interested in selling American music to Canadians instead of finding Canadian talent. And a lot of people in Toronto hated the Yorkville scene. City leaders, politicians, Syl Apps, who's like a Leafs Hall of Famer, who was also a city councillor, called it a festering sore, like in the heart of Toronto, that had to be eradicated. People were talking about police would park paddy wagons at the corner of, I think, Cumberland and just load them up on a Friday night. People talking about shipping hippies off to labor camps and that they weren't contributing anything.
Jeez.
And by the end of the decade, there are fears too about there's a hepatitis outbreak that's just blown out of control, and people talking about corrupted youth and stuff. So the city ends up moving in with developers, demolishing a lot of the coffee houses, building new fancy hotels, and sort of starting to transform it into the fancy shopping district today. So a lot of the people in Yorkville don't stick around. They move to the States to make it big. So it's also where like Zalyanovsky, who goes on to co-found the Loving Spoonful, and Denny Doherty, who becomes one of the Mamas and the Papas. Jack London and the Sparrows become Steppenwolf. Young goes and starts Buffalo Springfield. He just buys a hearse and parks it on Avenue
I've heard
Road,
about that.
loads it with a bunch of hippies and drives off to LA and is like opening for the Byrds on tour in
Insane.
Springfield within like days. He'd been in a band here too, the Mina Birds, with Rick James, who came here to avoid fighting in Vietnam, and ended up becoming the super freak guy.
Yeah, okay, I was that Rick James.
Yeah, he's in a band with Neil Young. They get introduced by Joni Mitchell. They get signed to Motown, the Mina Birds. They go to Detroit, start recording their album. But Rick James gets into a fight with their manager over drug debts, I think. So the manager turns him into the FBI because he's AWOL from the Navy. He gets thrown in jail. The band has to break up. Neil Young decides to move to LA, starts Buffalo Springfield. Rick James has to wait years to start his career because and so he's an 80s pop star because it takes him longer.
Right, instead of the 60s. And frankly, I have to admit, because I'm, grew up in the 90s and 2000s, I pretty much only know Rick James from Dave Chappelle going, "I'm Rick James, bitch." So, although I guess I know Super Freak. Is that the song where it's like, "Super freaky, ow"? Yeah. That kind of, okay, yeah.
That's a Yorkville in the 60s guy.
Wow.
So Yorkville eventually gets wiped out, but these people carry on kind of the legacy of the neighborhood. And while some of them move to the States and blow up, and like the airwaves of the 60s and 70s are just filled with people from Yorkville.
Ironically, some of that is called the California sound because they just moved there, but they come from Toronto.
The best songs in California are written by Canadians, which I don't think is a coincidence. I think it probably helps to have grown up with Canadian winters if you really want to appreciate what California is.
Yes.
You get a little extra excited, I imagine, when you
California dreaming on such a winter day, that kind of thing.
Exactly.
Wow.
When a lot of the people from Yorkville, I always think about it as the hippies lost the battle, but kind of won the war for Toronto. The people got driven out of that neighborhood as it got redeveloped. There was Rochdale College down the block too, which was an experimental college for a while as part of U of T that got shut down. But a lot of those people just moved to different parts of Toronto, started their scenes there, and kept on with their life's work. They didn't stop being musicians or artists or writers. They ended up moving to other parts of the city, starting those scenes, and I think laying the groundwork to transform Toronto as a much more culturally vibrant place with all these venues and music cities and art scenes. And I think it's when I want to talk about how, in practice, on the ground, did Toronto change from this incredibly conservative British place into the city of today that's so multicultural. I think Yorkville is a great example, and the Beatniks and the hippies of that process, that this neighborhood, low rents that attracted these European immigrants, brought new culture with them that attracted these young people and transformed the city in a way that you can follow sort of step by step how that process unfolded, and is mixed in with all these famous names and stuff. And it always helps to be able to name drop.
Yeah, always. Yeah. Your ears perk up. This is obviously hard, and things are fragmented now because of the internet and because of social media and stuff. So scenes don't happen in the same way. But in your experience, obviously traveling around Toronto and being part of different cultural scenes, it sounds like, do you think there's a Yorkville right now? Because I am part of the music scene, and to be honest with you, I don't know if there is. I think it's pretty split.
Yeah, I think today it seems to be a little all over the place. I'm not as hooked as I was when I was younger and could stand a little longer for Roe. By the time I was kind of growing up, it was Queen West. That's where I was going in my teenage years. When I was like 14 years old, I think my older sister took me to see the Rio Statics play an all-ages show, the old ultrasound on Queen West. And
I literally just interviewed Dave Bedini for the other podcast that I have. Which was really cool.
Yeah, going to see them was one of those moments of falling in love with the city, realizing that was a thing. And she was like neighbors with Tim Vesley or Don Kerr, maybe.
Wow.
And knew them. So talk to them as human beings. The idea that you could be in a rock band and also exist in a neighborhood
as just a human-sized human. Yeah, I know. It seems so odd.
Yeah, and that opened my eyes a lot. So started going down to Queen West and engaging with the city more. And then by the time I was doing the music magazine stuff in the early 2000s, I had all shifted west and Ossington and Dundas and that area, which is where at least the rock and folk scenes was all happening then. It does feel a little more diffuse now.
It's a little more diffuse, but you're about right. That's still kind of where it is, in my opinion, at least for those genres, which are the ones that I'm most familiar with. Obviously, unfortunately, some venues have shut down and stuff. Obviously, recently, pandemic didn't help anything. But yeah, it's all a lot on the West still. A lot of it's on the West End. Okay, if I may, here's the more selfish question. But it has to do with how I got into history as well and interested. So I was born in Vancouver, but I did most of my growing up in Unionville, Ontario, Markham. And something that town prided itself on, and you know this because there are signs everywhere. It's known as Historic Unionville, and it was founded in 1793, and they're proud to be this thing. Our claim to fame is it's where Fred Varley died, the painter, a part of the Group of Seven. And as little kids, we went to this Fred Varley museum that they set up for the Group of Seven. So basically, and it's carried me all the way up till now. That's how I got interested. I was like, wow, people have been walking around here, not Indigenous, obviously, forever, but people, Unionville has been a town as I know it since 1793. That's so crazy. I read about Tom Thomson because I got introduced to him through Fred Varley and learning about all that, blah, blah, blah. Do you know anything about Markham or Unionville?
Not too much. Some Markham.
Yeah.
They're interesting stories about a bunch of stuff that was happening north of the city in those founding days too.
Yes.
So I think Markham, I'm not refreshed on all this, but there's Simcoe handed out a contract, or Peter Russell, his sort of temporary replacement. This guy, William Birdsey, who was bringing over German immigrants. And
there are multiple schools named after William Birdsey in the area that I grew up in. So, yeah.
Yeah, and he and his settlers are chopping down trees to help build Yonge Street, sort of carve it out of the forest, and then get, I think, kind of screwed over by the government in York and never really get what they were promised in return. And it fizzles a little bit. But yeah, his name is one you'll find all over. He's got a park where Toronto's now new famous dog fountain.
Yes.
Iron Building is Birdsey Park. He's an artist too, so he's got some interesting art history stuff as well. And yeah, the Fred Varley story, someone mentioned to me recently, because I gave a talk where I talked a bit about Lauren Harris, another one of the Group 7 artists. And he had quite a strange, scandalous personal life where he fell in love with his best friend's wife. And she ended up leaving him. I think Lauren Harris's wife left him when she found out. And then his best friend's wife moved in with him.
Jeez.
Spending the rest of their lives together, which I love because in 2025, you think of the Group of 7 as a very traditional,
buttoned up, older men. Actually, you don't think of them as these. The Beatniks were young in their early 20s. You think of, just to compare them, you think of them as smoking weed or hash and going out and partying and drinking, but you think of the Group of 7 as listening to classical music and reading late at night and that kind of
But
thing.
in their day, they were that. Like, they were 20 years old,
Yeah.
one day too, and they were kind of smashing tradition and pushing boundaries. Just one thing I want to do this year is do a whole lecture filled with scandals and the Group of Seven.
I will be at that lecture, my friend.
And his personal life is plenty scandalous. Well, for one thing, they were doing this art that in Canada was incredibly cutting edge. Impressionism, they're the first ones, and the people they know, their friends, in this sort of generation of them, people like A.Y. Jackson, Lauren Harris, who'd gone to school in Europe and seen the Impressionists there, seen Matisse and Van Gogh and all that, Monet, came back and started painting Canada that same way, and everyone hated it. They were trashed by the critics. They were called all sorts of names for doing it. It wasn't until England kind of embraced them that Canadians, as we so often do, were like, oh, someone else likes it.
Yeah, exactly. Like, wait, that's ours.
Yeah. In the early days, they're putting out, like, they're promoting their shows by using quotes from the critics that are about how terrible they are, because this is like really out there stuff for Canada, where a lot of our paintings in the 1800s are just like a cow standing in
or a portrait, or something.
Really traditional stuff. So they're super on the cutting edge. They're transforming the city socially too. They're really good friends with Francis Loring and Florence Weil, who are sculptors, who are also life partners, live together, work together their whole lives, having met in Chicago at an art school, lived in Greenwich Village for a while and were part of the scene there, until Loring's dad decided that Greenwich Village was a little too out there and that he would move them to Toronto. He'd pay for them to move here and live here, hoping that Toronto's kind of conservative but rub off on them. But instead it ended up kind of being the other way around. They ended up in this old church. They got moved to a property. It's still there, kind of this big triangular church in the Moore Park neighborhood, which was their living space and studio for the rest of their lives. You'll find sculptures of theirs all over the city. They had a famous lion column that used to stand at the the entrance to the QEW that's now at the mouth of the Humber River. You can still go visit it. It was one of the main landmarks in Toronto for many years. But at the same time that they're doing that and being these cutting-edge sculptors, they're also throwing these parties with the Group of Seven and Frederick Banting, who's an artist, but also the guy who discovered insulin, and just being seen around the neighborhood. The kids in Moore Park, I'll call them the clay ladies, because they would hand out lumps of clay to all the kids in the neighborhood so they could get interested in art too, and just set the example of being two women living and working together in like the 1920s, even earlier than that. Are part of this generation that we now think of as very old, traditional, early 1900s people, because they seem conservative to us, but in their youth were absolutely breaking down these boundaries.
Right.
So I think there's a ton of that kind of stuff to talk about with the Group of Seven. And Fred Varley, when I gave this talk that touched on some of this,
I just bought a biography about him by Mary Tippett. If you know Mary Tippett, but yeah.
I need to look into that, because someone, I guess, lived in Unionville said that they grew up with stories of Fred Varley living in a throuple, in a threesome there, and that he had his own kind of scandalous private life that eyebrows.
I lived like 30 seconds from Main Street, which is where first of all the gallery is, and where he supposedly had his own gallery and lived with this woman. So that's probably what you're referring to. But it just that's what got me super interested. I was like, whoa, this guy who I picture as part of Canadian history, like, lived in this house that I pass that is now 2 houses down from what's become a transformed Starbucks. It's just bizarre, but it's so cool. But yeah, that's crazy. Clearly, like, the thing that got me, what made me want to read this, other than the fact that it's his proximity to where I grew up, was like you're describing, there is this early life that's exciting with them, but also specifically, a lot of them went over to paint the war that was going on. And I'm really interested in that aspect of it as well.
Yeah, I am fascinated by that too. And a bunch of them ended up during the war. There's this big Canadian, I think he's a newspaper tycoon who ends up being big in the British government during the First World War, Lord Beaverbrook. Huge name. He gets mentioned in a Kinks song.
Oh, wow.
The Second World War. And he decides that he's going to start something called the Canadian War Records Office, which during the First World War is just going to hire Canadian artists to kind of represent the Canadian experience of the war. And it ends up hiring a lot of the giants of the Canadian art world at the time. Francis and Loring are hired to do sculptures sort of on the home front. And a lot of the painters are a group of 7 artists who end up painting the war. A.Y. Jackson was fighting in Flanders on the front lines. He'd been wounded and was literally digging out a latrine hole, I think, about to be sent into the Battle of the Somme when someone came up and was like, "You're a painter, right?
Oh my God.
Fighting and just travel around painting it all instead." And it means that we have these incredibly powerful depictions of the war painted in the exact same style we know, like Algonquin Park being
right,
but it's the front lines, and A.Y. Jackson having like chlorine gas attack clouds. Fred Varley's got one, I think it's at the War Museum in Ottawa, it's a bunch of corpses in a wheelbarrow in like a bombed out.
For what? It's called For What or something?
Yeah, and he calls it For What.
Yeah.
Questioning the whole war effort.
I love it.
As a government employee being hired by the government to recreate the Canadian experience of the war, which is all stuff, that you don't associate with the group of 7 at all.
No.
They have a much more dramatic history than you learn growing up when you start in high school. They're doing all this, dramatic, scandalous, even death-defying stuff.
Well, thank you so much for talking to me about all of this stuff. I guess I have one question that I think I'll ask historians, because I always like this phrase, but I always wonder how much historians actually think it's true. I don't remember who said it. Maybe you'll know. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. Yeah. Do you think that's true? It's like, obviously similar things happen over time, not the exact same things.
Yeah, it is amazing how much the stories and their relevance kind of changes with time. Like, for instance, Toronto, the city set up for loyalist refugees from the American Revolution, just across the lake from the United States, has had this deep relationship with the U.S. for ages.
That's true.
I'm also the host and co-creator of a Canadian history documentary series, Canadiana, where we've traveled all across the country. We do episodes we post on YouTube.
Yeah, I've seen it.
Yeah, we've had a lot of fun learning about the history sort of all across the country. And a lot of our most popular episodes are ones that deal with the history of the relationship between Canada and the United States, which is incredibly deep. Like the Alaska Highway through the Yukon was built by the Americans during the Second World War. The Rideau Canal, which we think of as a place to get beaver tails and go skating, built in case the Americans ever invaded again after the War of 1812, when they did. Canadians are playing huge roles in the American Civil War. It has a deep impact on us and our history. And we were telling all those stories a few years ago when it didn't feel quite as urgent to understand the history as it does now, disturbingly and unfortunately. But I think that's part of the value of history for sure, is the understanding how things got here and what's possible and the things that have happened in the past. Help you understand the present and the future and what might happen next. And the fact that, I think history kind of does rhyme. Sometimes deeply unfortunate ways means that they're stories that end up becoming endlessly relevant to the world today.
Is there anything you want to mention as as we go? Anything you're working on? Anything you want to promote that's coming up? This will be out in very, very early February.
I think I'm going to be doing one of my next big projects is going to be another online course about the secret history of Toronto, filled with stories about spies and traitors and thieves and kind of undergroundy kind of stuff.
Cool.
There's going to be a lot about the relationship between Toronto and the U.S. Around that too. So I think particularly relevant stories right now. And I just renamed my newsletter. So I've got it's now called the Toronto Time Traveler newsletter, where I share a story every week or so and sort of local heritage news, event listings. So if you're interested in learning more about the history of the city, I try to make it kind of a one-stop shop for you to be able to keep up on what's going on around the city. So yeah, talks and tours and everything too this year. And the newsletter is a great way to kind of keep up with everything I've got going on. So if you want to check my stuff out, then that's an easy way to do it.
Sweet. All right. Thanks so much, Adam. I appreciate it a lot.
Thank you for having me.